You know this face. You have seen it 1,000 times, even if you never learned his name. The hard eyes, the heavy mustache, the gloved hand reaching out of the poster, one finger pointing straight at you. Your country needs you. It is the most famous recruiting image ever made. The picture that pulled a generation of young men out of their homes and into the trenches of the First World War. Copied, parodied, borrowed from. America's own Uncle Sam would steal the very same pose a year later. The man behind that finger was Britain's greatest soldier hero, Field Marshal Lord Kitchener. The Empire raised statues to him. Mothers named their sons after him. Newspapers treated his word as gospel. And when he drowned at sea in 1916, the nation grieved as though it had lost a king. But there is another picture of this man, one that never made it onto a poster, one his own country worked hard to forget. A decade before he pointed the world toward war, Kitchener commanded a campaign in South Africa that ended with tens of thousands of civilians, most of them children, dead behind barbed wire, in camps the British themselves called concentration camps. This is the story that famous poster was built to bury, how the face of "Your country needs you" came to run Britain's concentration camps. To understand the man, you have to start with the legend the public was handed. By 1914, Herbert Kitchener was not merely a general. He was the empire made flesh, the reassuring face of British power in an anxious age. For 4 decades, his career had read like an adventure serial. As a young engineer, he had mapped the Holy Land, learning Arabic and slipping through Ottoman territory in disguise. He had climbed through the ranks, not as a dashing cavalryman, but as a cold, meticulous organizer, a man who won by preparation, patience, and overwhelming force. He had a reputation, even among his own officers, for being cold and unknowable. A lifelong bachelor who lived entirely for the work, trusted almost no one, and drove the men beneath him without mercy or apology. He did not want to be liked. He wanted to be effective. That temperament, so admired in a conqueror, would prove catastrophic the day the results he was ordered to deliver depended on the suffering of people who could not fight back. He avenged a national humiliation in the Sudan. He governed Egypt and later India in the crown's name. He was the man the empire sent when it wanted a job finished, whatever the cost. So when the Great War began, the government did something no one had done before. It put a serving general's face on the recruiting drive itself. The artist Alfred Leet drew that pointing figure in the autumn of 1914, and it became a sensation overnight. Between the Boer War and the Great War, Kitchener ruled as commander-in-chief in India, where he fought a bitter power struggle with the viceroy, Lord Curzon, over who truly controlled the army, and won, forcing Curzon out. It was pure Kitchener, patient, relentless, total. He did not share power, he accumulated it. By 1914, there was no more trusted soldier anywhere in the empire, and no one better placed to become its living symbol. 2.5 million men would volunteer under that gaze. Kitchener's army, the papers called it, the largest volunteer force in British history. His name became a banner, his stare a shorthand for duty itself. This is the Kitchener the world was meant to remember. The pointing finger, the steady eyes, the promise that the empire was in safe hands. Hold that image in your mind, because to find the other one, we have to follow him back. First to the desert and then to the veld, and watch, step by step, how this hero learned his trade. In 1898, Kitchener marched an Anglo-Egyptian army south up the Nile with a single purpose: to destroy the modest state that 13 years earlier had killed the British hero General Gordon at Khartoum. He built a railway across the desert to carry his troops. Engineering is warfare, exactly his style. And on the plain of Omdurman, the reckoning arrived in a single morning. Kitchener's men had Maxim machine guns and modern artillery. Their enemy came at them on foot and on horseback, with spears and old rifles and reckless courage. In a few hours, roughly 10,000 modest fighters lay dead. Kitchener lost a few dozen men. A young war correspondent named Winston Churchill watched it happen and called it not a battle, but an execution. The machine age meeting men who never had a chance. In the days that followed, Kitchener let his men deal harshly with the enemy wounded left on the field and ordered the tomb of the Mahdi torn open and destroyed. Even in an age that expected imperial ruthlessness, some voices back home were shocked. Kitchener was unmoved. The job was done, the message was sent, and the reputation of a hard man who finished things was sealed. The lesson Kitchener carried out of the Sudan was simple and cold. Overwhelming force, applied without sentiment, wins wars. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was efficiency, a method. And 2 years into the next war, he would apply that same method not to an enemy army, but to an entire people. In October 1899, the British Empire went to war with two small farming republics in southern Africa, the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Their people were the Boers, descendants of Dutch settlers who had trekked inland generations before, and beneath their pastures lay the richest gold fields on earth. London expected a short, tidy colonial war. Over in months, it got the opposite, one of the longest, costliest, and most shameful campaigns in imperial history. The Boers were farmers, badly outnumbered, but they were superb marksmen who knew every ridge and riverbed. In the first months, they humiliated the British, trapping whole columns and besieging their towns. Stung, London poured in 250,000 soldiers, more than the Boer republics had citizens. By the middle of 1900, the British had taken the Boer capitals and raised their flag. The government in London declared the war as good as won. It had not been an easy road there. In one dreadful stretch the newspapers called Black Week, British generals marched their men straight into Boer rifle fire and lost battle after battle. Whole towns, Ladysmith, Kimberley, Mafeking, were cut off and besieged for months, while the empire looked on, humiliated, from half a world away. That shock hardened the mood in London. By the time the tide turned, the war was no longer only about winning. It was about making the Boers pay for the embarrassment they had caused. But the Boers refused to accept it. Under young commanders like Louis Botha, they abandoned the cities and turned to guerrilla war. They broke into small, fast bands on horseback, striking railways, ambushing supply columns, then vanishing back into the veld, into farms that fed them, hid them, and passed them word. The mightiest army on earth found itself chasing ghosts across a country the size of France, always a day behind. The commander-in-chief, Lord Roberts, reached for a brutal answer. If the farms fed the fighters, the farms would burn, and the women and children left homeless would be gathered up and held in guarded camps where they could no longer supply the commandos. Roberts began this policy, but at the end of 1900 he sailed home a hero and handed both the command and the cruel machinery he had built to his chief of staff, Horatio Herbert Kitchener. Kitchener looked at the guerrilla problem the way an engineer looks at a blueprint. If he could not catch the fighters, he would strip away everything that kept them alive. First, he caged the land itself. He strung barbed wire across the veld and built thousands of small stone blockhouses, squat forts, a rifle shot apart. Dividing the whole country into fenced boxes his columns could sweep clean, one by one. It was slow, patient, industrial war. Across that fenced landscape, Kitchener's men ran vast sweeps they called drives. Long lines of soldiers advancing for days on end, herding everything in front of them toward the wire. Fighters, yes, but also families, wagons, and herds. It worked like a net dragged slowly across an entire country, and everything the net caught that could not fight, the women, the children, the elderly, had to be put somewhere. That somewhere was the camps. Then he burned the farms. Not a few, tens of thousands of them. British columns torched houses and barns, killed or drove off millions of cattle and sheep, poisoned wells, salted fields, and smashed the plows and mills a farming people needed to survive. This was not the chaos of battle. It was policy, written down, ordered from the top, carried out farm by farm across two republics. An entire agricultural society was taken apart on purpose until there was almost nothing left standing. But scorched earth created a problem of its own, a human one. Every burned farm produced refugees, women, children, and old people, standing in the ashes of their homes with nowhere to go and no food to find. Soon there were tens of thousands of them, wandering a ruined land in the middle of a war. Kitchener answered with the same cold logic that had won him the Sudan. Concentrate them. Gather every displaced family into camps, fenced, guarded, and counted, where they could no longer help the men still fighting. On paper, this looked almost humane. Shelter for people the army itself had made homeless. That is exactly how London described it. But the reality behind the wire would become one of the darkest chapters in the whole history of the British Empire, and a chapter that empire would spend the next 100 years trying not to look at. But before we step inside that wire, hold on to one thing. The Scorched Earth campaign did not only burn buildings, it destroyed the food supply of an entire region in a land already prone to drought. Almost everyone Kitchener's columns drove into the camps was hungry before they even arrived. The machine that filled the camps and the machine that starved the country were one and the same machine, and Kitchener ran both ends of it. By 1901, the British had built a network of more than 40 camps stretched across South Africa, holding well over 100,000 people. The authorities gave them a name that, in this war, entered the English language for good and never left it: concentration camps. The people did not choose to come. Soldiers arrived at a farm, gave the family a few minutes to gather what they could carry, set the house alight, and loaded them onto open railway trucks or ox wagons for a journey of days. Many arrived already sick, already grieving, already stripped of everything they had ever owned. And they were sorted on arrival. The families of surrendered men in one class, the families of men still fighting in another, hungrier one. From the very first hour, the camp was built less as a shelter than as a lever. Some camps became bywords for death. At Bloemfontein, the largest, the graves multiplied faster than the burial parties could dig them. Across the whole system, in the worst months, the death rate for children inside the camps ran many times higher than in the crowded slums of Victorian Britain, a scale of loss no ordinary epidemic could explain. This was not a natural disaster. It was the direct, foreseeable result of a policy: clear the land, concentrate the people, and then fail to feed or treat them. Conditions inside were catastrophic from the start. Families were packed into thin bell tents with almost no bedding, baking under the summer sun and freezing on the high-felled nights. Fuel was scarce, so food was often half-cooked. Fresh water was rationed and frequently foul. There were too few latrines, too little soap, and almost no medicine. And in a decision that turned neglect into something closer to punishment, the camp administration gave smaller rations to the families of Boers who were still out fighting, using hungry women and children as leverage against their husbands and fathers. Into these crowded, hungry camps came the diseases that always follow hunger and filth: measles, typhoid, dysentery, whooping cough, pneumonia. They spread through the tent lines like fire through dry grass, and they killed the children first. Small bodies, already weakened by poor food, had nothing left to fight the fevers, and the camps had almost no medicine to give them. In the worst months of 1901, children were dying in their thousands. Picture what that meant. Tent by tent, a mother watches one child burn with fever for days, with nothing to give but water, and then buries that child, and turns back to the tent to find the next one already sick. Whole families were hollowed out in a matter of weeks. This was happening not in some remote horror hidden from the world, but in official British camps run by British officers, recorded in British ledgers under the command of the Empire's most celebrated soldier. By the time the fever seasons had passed, the official toll among the Boers stood at somewhere between 26 and 28,000 dead in the camps, and the majority were children under the age of 16. Think about the scale. The Boer republics counted only a few 100,000 people to begin with. In a matter of 2 years, they lost a generation of their young, not on any battlefield, not with rifles in their hands, but behind British wire of hunger and disease. And none of this was hidden in some secret file. The camps kept careful monthly returns, and those returns show the death rate among camp children climbing to levels that would have emptied a city. Officials in South Africa and in London read those figures month after month as the toll rose and rose. The dying was recorded in real time, in the Empire's own neat handwriting, and still, for month after month, almost nothing was done about it. And there is a second death toll that most versions of this story leave out completely. Alongside the Boer camps, the British ran a separate network of camps for black Africans, farm laborers and their families, swept up in the very same clearances. Their camps were, if anything, worse supplied. Their records were kept far more carelessly. At least 14 to 20,000 of them are believed to have died, and because no one bothered to count them properly, the true number is simply lost. Their near total absence from the history books is not an accident. It is part of the same injustice. And Kitchener himself? To him, the camps were a line item, a logistical detail in the business of winning. He rarely visited them and showed little interest in what went on inside. His concern was the war, and the camps served the war by cutting the fighters off from the families who fed them. The mass death of children behind the wire did not move him to change course. It would take an outsider, someone the government never saw coming, to force the Empire to finally look at what it had built. Her name was Emily Hobhouse. She was a middle-aged Englishwoman, a Cornish vicar's daughter, with no rank, no title, and no official standing of any kind. And she would do more lasting damage to Kitchener's reputation than any Boer commando ever managed. Late in 1900, back in Britain, she heard whispers of women and children suffering in the camps, and she did the one thing almost no one in power had bothered to do. She went to South Africa to see for herself. She had no army behind her, no newspaper, no political party, only a train ticket, a notebook, and a stubborn refusal to look away. She went from camp to camp on permission that the authorities soon regretted giving, handing out what little relief she could and writing down names, numbers, and conditions in patient detail. What she was really carrying back to England was the one thing no minister could answer with a press release: proof. What she found at Bloemfontein and the other camps she reached horrified her. Children shaking with fever on bare ground. Families living on rations crawling with maggots. No soap, no beds, no milk for infants, barely any medicine at all. She wrote it all down in plain, careful language. No exaggeration, no hysteria, just what she saw, tent by tent. Then she carried her report back to Britain and pushed it in front of anyone who would take it. Politicians, ministers, newspapers. The government's first instinct was not to fix the camps. It was to attack the woman. Officials called her hysterical, disloyal, a traitor, that bloody woman, a friend to the enemy. They tried to bury her under insults. But the report would not die, and one photograph in particular refused to be argued away. Her name was Lizzie Van Zyl, a young girl who wasted away in the Bloemfontein camp. A photograph of her, skeletal and dying, was published to show the world what these camps did to children. The government's defenders had their answer ready. They claimed the girl had been neglected by her own mother, that the camp was not to blame, that the family had done it to themselves. Hobhouse and the doctors who had actually seen Lizzie rejected that flatly. The child had starved on camp rations, in camp conditions, like thousands of others. The rush to blame a grieving mother told you everything about how far the authorities would go rather than blame themselves. But Hobhouse had lit a fuse, and it kept burning. Her report reached Parliament, where the leader of the opposition rose and asked how a civilized nation could make war on women and children, and coined a phrase that stuck: methods of barbarism. The government was cornered. Grudgingly, to prove Hobhouse wrong, it sent out an official inquiry of its own, and, in a first for the empire, an all-women commission, led by the campaigner Millicent Fawcett. That phrase, methods of barbarism, split the country in two. To many, it was close to treason to say such a thing in wartime. To others, it was the only honest description of what was being done in Britain's name. Newspapers took sides. Public meetings dissolved into shouting. For the first time, ordinary Britons were forced to argue at their own breakfast tables over whether their own army was committing an atrocity. Hobhouse had turned a quiet, distant horror into a loud national quarrel, and a national quarrel could not simply be filed and forgotten. Fawcett had partly been sent to discredit Hobhouse. Instead, her commission walked the same tent lines and confirmed the horror in dry official language and demanded urgent reform. Under that pressure, the army finally acted. Better rations, clean water, proper sanitation, real medical care, and the death rate fell sharply, quickly, dramatically. That was the most damning proof of all. The mass dying had never been necessary or inevitable. It had simply not been treated as important until one private citizen made it impossible to ignore. Kitchener's own answer to Emily Hobhouse was contempt. When she tried to come back to the camps with relief supplies, he had her turned away and in 1901 deported, escorted out of South Africa as though she, and not the dying, were the danger. To him, she was an interfering woman meddling in a soldier's business. But by then she had already done the one thing that mattered. She had turned the empire's own conscience against the empire's own policy. And in the end, that conscience took more ground than any Boer rifle ever had. Emily Hobhouse paid a heavy price for what she did. She was vilified at home for years, and the work broke her health. But in South Africa, she was never forgotten. When she died in 1926, her ashes were carried to Bloemfontein and buried at the foot of the memorial to the very women and children she had tried to save, honored by a nation that was not even her own. The empire she had embarrassed gave her almost nothing. The people she had fought for gave her a place among their dead. In May 1902, the Boers finally laid down their arms. The scorched earth had done exactly what it was designed to do. With their farms burned, their livestock gone, and their wives and children dying behind wire, the fighters in the field had nothing left to protect and nowhere left to come home to. They surrendered not because they were beaten in battle, but because their whole world had been taken apart behind them. Kitchener had won the war he was sent to win. He was rewarded lavishly. A grateful parliament voted him a fortune and another grand title. He collected the thanks of the nation and sailed off to his next great post, Commander-in-Chief in India. For Kitchener, the Boer War was a success on his record, a step up the ladder. The camps were not a stain on his career. They were barely mentioned in it at all. And the camps themselves, they were quietly folded away, and in Britain, quietly forgotten. In the national memory, the war became a hard but honorable fight. Plucky Boer marksmen, dramatic sieges, brave British Tommies. The more than 40,000 civilians who had died behind the wire slipped almost entirely out of the story the empire told about itself. For the Boers, it was the exact opposite. The camps became a permanent, defining wound, a grief carried down through generations, woven into their identity and their politics for the rest of the century. In time, the Boers would raise their own monuments to the camp dead, teach their children the names, and carry that grievance forward into the politics of the coming century. A wound cut that deep does not simply close over. It gets inherited, remembered, retold, and passed from parents to children long after the last camp fence had rusted away. This is how an atrocity disappears. Not always by being denied outright, often just by being outshone. Put a famous victory in the front window, and a beloved hero, and a stirring tale of empire, and the camps quietly recede into a footnote almost no one ever reads. And within a few short years, no single image would do more of that quiet forgetting than the one Kitchener was about to become the face of. 12 years after the Boer War, the world fell into a far greater one. In August 1914, Britain declared war on Germany, and a frightened government reached for the one man the public trusted above all others. Kitchener was made Secretary of State for War, the professional soldier who would steady the nation. And almost alone among the leaders of 1914, he told the truth no one wanted to hear. This war would not be over by Christmas. It would grind on for years, he warned, and it would devour men by the million. He was right, and so he set out to raise the largest volunteer army in British history. His face went up on that poster, his finger pointed, and the young men came in their millions to sign their names beneath his gaze. Many of them would die in the mud of the Somme and Passchendaele. Kitchener's army, the very force that carried his name. Here is the quiet, terrible symmetry of his life. The recruiter and the reckoning were the same man. The public simply never joined the two together. The pointing finger in London and the barbed wire in South Africa. The Great War did not treat him kindly. The vast army he raised took time to train and to arm, and when British shells ran short in 1915, some of the blame landed on his desk. Younger politicians began to work around him. His near godlike authority quietly slipped. The methodical conqueror of open country had no easy answer for the frozen deadlock of the trenches, but his face stayed on the wall, still pointing, still recruiting, long after his real power had begun to fade. In June 1916, at the height of his fame, Kitchener boarded the cruiser HMS Hampshire on a secret mission to Russia. Off the Orkney Islands, in a rising gale, the ship struck a German mine and went down in a matter of minutes. Kitchener was never seen again. Britain reacted as though it had lost a monarch. Tolling bells, black armbands, a whole nation in mourning. The face on the poster had passed cleanly into legend, and the legend, polished in grieving, had no room in it at all for the camps. So who was Kitchener, really? For most of the 20th century, the answer came easily. A hero, the pointing poster, the avenger of Khartoum, the organizer who built an army out of thin air when his country needed it most. That is the Kitchener carved into stone monuments, printed in school books, and stamped on the memory of the empire. But the record holds a second man, standing right beside the hero, the commander who turned overwhelming, mechanized force onto a civilian population, who burned a country down to its roots and gathered its women and children behind wire, where tens of thousands of them died of hunger and disease, who treated that mass dying as an administrative detail and never let it trouble his strategy for a single day. And beside the Boers, the thousands of black Africans who died in separate camps that history barely bothered to record at all. Both of these men are real, both are fully documented, and the uncomfortable, unavoidable truth is that they are the same man, and that his own empire chose for 100 years to remember only one of them. Kitchener was not uniquely evil. He was something more ordinary and more disturbing, an efficient servant of empire who did what the empire asked and was celebrated for it, and never had to answer for the cost. The phrase he made infamous did not stay behind in South Africa. Within a single generation, other governments would borrow the same basic idea, rounding up whole populations behind wire in the name of security, and drive it into depths the Edwardians could barely have imagined. Kitchener intended none of that. But his war helped teach the 20th century a lesson it would learn far too well, that a modern state, told it is defending itself, can decide that the suffering of the innocent is simply the price of winning. We like to tell ourselves that atrocities are the work of monsters, men who look nothing like us. Kitchener is a harder lesson than that. He was competent, disciplined, and widely admired. He believed he was doing his duty, and almost his entire society agreed with him. That is exactly why his story matters. Not because he was a villain out of a storybook, but because he shows how ordinary, orderly, respectable people can preside over mass death and call it strategy. The face on the poster is not only a warning about one man, it is a warning about how easily everyone else agreed to look the other way. The camps he ran were not the last of their kind. Others, in other countries and other decades, would build far worse. And the words themselves, concentration camp, would come to carry a horror darker than anything on that South African veld. But the phrase entered our language here, under a British flag, on the watch of the most admired soldier in the empire, in a war remembered as honorable. So the next time you see that famous poster, the hard eyes, the mustache, the pointing hand, remember that it was built to make you look. And remember what it was also built to make you forget. The hero and the man behind the wire were never two people. They were always one. And the poster is simply how the empire chose which of them you would be allowed to see.